We've already covered the fuel crisis and the front line in earlier videos. This one is different. It's about a single night, July 19th into July 20th, and what it reveals about how close this war has actually gotten to ordinary Russian life, not the battlefield. Welcome back. Let's start with what happened hour by hour. From 8:30 in the evening until 5 in the morning, Moscow's own mayor says more than 400 drones approached the region. Most were intercepted far from the capital. Another 85 were shot down closer in on final approach. That still leaves a meaningful number that got through, enough to hit a wild berries logistics center in Koledino, an oil depot in the village of Lvovsky near Podolsk, and an industrial park at Yuzhnie Vorota in Domodedovo. Flights were restricted at 3 Moscow airports. Residents in Podolsk, Domodedovo, and Odintsovo reported explosions, fires, and falling debris damaging homes and cars. This wasn't an isolated incident either. It came just one night after drones had already hit Wildberries warehouses in Elektrostal and in Kotovsk, hundreds of kilometers away in Tambov region, on the night before. 2 large-scale strikes on the same kind of target on back-to-back nights is not something that reads as coincidence to anyone watching closely on either side of the border. For scale, this single night's total builds on numbers that were already climbing fast. Moscow's own figures put the count at roughly 1,900 drones targeting the region across just the previous week, between July 11th and 18th alone. Add this latest wave, and the running total for the month approaches something Moscow has never had to publicly acknowledge before. Not because the Kremlin wants to share that number, but because enough independent outlets, residents, and even the mayor's own statements have made it impossible to fully hide. The tactic behind this is straightforward, even if the scale is not. Ukraine sends drones simultaneously along different routes, in numbers that push past what any air defense network can fully process at once. Some get shot down, some get jammed and pushed off course by electronic warfare. And this is where it gets genuinely embarrassing for Moscow. Some of the drones that Russian jamming systems successfully diverted didn't crash harmlessly into a field. They got redirected straight into residential buildings inside the city Russia was trying to protect. The defense system built to shield the capital ended up, in at least some cases, doing part of the damage itself. Now, why these specific targets? Because the choice says more than the damage does. Wildberries isn't a random company. It's Russia's largest online retailer, practically the country's version of Amazon. And its logistics network is something like the day-to-day backbone of how tens of millions of ordinary Russians shop. Koledino wasn't its first hit either. Earlier strikes this month had already knocked out roughly 7% of the company's total logistics capacity, with repair costs reportedly running past 20 billion rubles even before this latest strike added to the total. The oil depot in Lvovsky matters for a similar reason. It feeds fuel into both civilian life and military logistics in the Moscow region at the same time, which is exactly the kind of dual-purpose target that's hard to defend without admitting what it's really protecting. And the industrial park at Yuzhny Vorota fits the same logic. Not a single factory, but a distribution hub. The kind of place where damage doesn't just destroy one company's product. It ripples outward into everyone downstream who depended on that hub actually functioning on schedule. There's an implicit deal every authoritarian government makes with people who aren't ideologically committed to it. Stay out of politics and life stays comfortable. Full shelves, working delivery, normal Tuesdays. That deal is what's actually being targeted here, more than any single warehouse. When packages stop arriving on time, when a seller's entire inventory burns with no compensation, when the sound of a drone becomes something you might hear over your own house instead of something happening on the news from a country hundreds of kilometers away, that comfortable, apolitical life stops being available, whether you want to decide in this war or not. It's a quieter kind of pressure than a missile, but arguably a more durable one because it doesn't fade the next morning once the smoke clears. And that gap between what's actually happening and what people are told is happening is where this gets most interesting. Russian state television has largely kept this off the air, or buried it under other agenda items, sticking to the same measured, everything is under control tone it has used for 3 straight years of this war. But state television isn't where this story is actually spreading. It's spreading through the sellers themselves, small business owners posting on social media that they've lost the equivalent of $25,000, some far more, with the company refusing to cover any of it. That's a very different kind of information channel than a news broadcast, and it's much harder for the Kremlin to shut down or discredit, because it's not coming from a Ukrainian source or a Western outlet. It's coming from angry Russians describing their own losses in their own words. There's actual data behind the psychological effect too, not just anecdote. Research following an earlier major strike on Moscow found that anti-war discussion across Russian social media jumped by 235% in the aftermath of that single incident. The logic researchers point to is simple. When drones reach Moscow specifically, people who've spent years treating this as someone else's war start asking questions about their own safety and start reading official statements with more skepticism than before. And this isn't only something outside observers are noticing. Some pro-war commentators have publicly insisted there's no panic and everything is normal, while others have more or less admitted in the same conversation that psychological pressure on the public is precisely the point of these strikes. When both sides of a debate agree on what the attacks are trying to do, that's usually a sign they're working. It's a strange kind of consensus, propagandists and their critics converging from opposite directions on the same read of what a drone flying over the Moscow region is actually meant to accomplish. None of this means Moscow is about to collapse, or that public opinion flips overnight because of one bad week. 20 million people live in the Moscow metropolitan area, and 146 million live in Russia as a whole. Most of them still get their information from television, still aren't personally affected, and still aren't in any immediate physical danger from a strike aimed at a warehouse, 40 kilometers away. But for 4 years, the defining feature of this war for the average Muscovite was distance. The fighting was something that happened to somebody else, somewhere else, on the other side of a border most of them will never cross. That distance is what actually broke on the night of July 19th. Not a supply chain, not an air defense radar, but the sense that Moscow itself was simply too far away to matter. A sense that had survived every previous year of this war largely intact. A warehouse, 42 kilometers from the Kremlin, is now, for a few hours at least, a war zone at 3 in the morning. The sellers whose goods burned are still posting about it because nobody else will tell their story for them. And somewhere in the space between what Russian television is showing and what Russian sellers are typing, that safe distance keeps getting smaller.